Hello, I'm Ronald Day, Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including from those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersection with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewer, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and to share your comments with us on Twitter at The Fortune Society. So today I have with me two great guests. All right, welcome to Both Sides of the Bars. And today's episode is voting and civic engagement. So let me do a brief introduction for our audience. So Jazz Hayden is a director at the Campaign to End the New Jim Crow and the founder of CEO and Still Here, Harlem Productions Incorporated. He's an activist and a community organizer dedicated to ending mass incarceration. Thanks, Jazz, for being on Both Sides of the Bars. I heard you've been here before, so thanks for coming back.
Okay.
Oh, been on M&N, but now you're on Both Sides of the Bars. Thanks. So Tomas Lopez, thank you for being on Both Sides of the Bars as well. Tomas is counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where his work focuses on voting rights and elections. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, he was a fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center's Immigrant Justice Project. There, he worked on litigation and advocacy challenging anti-discrimination legislation in Alabama. So thank you both for being on Both Sides of the Bars. So again, voting and civic engagement. I think that considering that the election is coming up soon, we have a primary in New York on August 19th. We have the election coming up in November, presidential election, and a bunch of other state campaigns. So I think this is an opportune time to have this conversation about voting and civic engagement, not for the general public, but for people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. So I want to get your perspectives on that particular issue. And we like to start from like giving the audience a really great understanding of the back issues related to this, assuming that they don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge about voting and civic engagement for people that have been impacted by the criminal justice system. So why don't we start with you, Jazz, and talk about the historical perspective of disenfranchisement.
Well, the whole concept of felon disenfranchisement has a long history. I mean, a history that goes back even before Christ, you know. And it's called social death, right? And it was practiced in Greece, and it was practiced in Rome, and it was practiced in Europe. And ultimately, it became a practice here.
Yeah.
You know, and felon disenfranchisement was a pushback to the emancipation of 4 million slaves. And it was a way of keeping them out of the political process. And ever since their emancipation, this has taken the form of poll tax, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And felon disenfranchisement was one of them. Then when we passed the Voting Rights Act in 1964, we eliminated the poll tax, the grandfather clause, you know, the literacy tests, and every other barrier to the voting box except felon disenfranchisement. When they reached the prison walls, they didn't go over, you know, but they declared victory and went off to African Americans began to vote in huge numbers and elect their public officials in their communities to represent them, you know. But at the same time, the prison wall, behind the prison wall was 300,000 prisoners in 1970, you know, in the entire nation. You know, today we have 2.2, to anywhere to 2.2 to 2.5 million. You know, so mass incarceration was kind of like a pushback to felon, you know, to the Voting Rights Act, and it's had a devastating effect on communities of poor people of color.
Thank you for that historical perspective. So, Tomas, as Jazz pointed out, again, millions of people now have lost the right to vote because of their felony conviction. Can you contextualize the issue a little bit more for us? I mean, how much is it happening in certain states? How much is it happening in this particular region? You know, what about New York State?
Sure. You know, Jazz brings up a really important point about the history of felony disenfranchisement laws. You know, many of the nation's laws do go back to the period immediately following the Civil War. And in some cases, there's really express evidence of the intent behind these laws. Now, when you fast forward to today, you know, what we have are about 6 million Americans who are unable to vote because of a felony conviction at some point in their past. And of that 6 million, you actually have about 4.5 million who aren't actually incarcerated even. These are people who are living and working in our communities. You know, they are our neighbors, they are our family members, but they're not able to have a say, just like so many of us, in how our community, how our government gets to run. Now, when you talk about the way in which felony disenfranchisement laws function, you know, we've got 50 states and we've got 50 different procedures, standards, and so it ranges from, you have 3 states, Florida, Iowa, and Kentucky, that actually have it that if you have a felony conviction, you never get to vote again. That's a lifetime ban. And the only way you get your right to vote back is getting it individually back through some kind of government process.
So it doesn't matter what type of felony conviction it is?
Any felony conviction in those 3 states, if you want to get your right to vote back, you've got to fill out an application. You know, in some cases, there's some kind of waiting period before you can even fill out the application. And what we see are really large swaths of the population, in those states where people can't vote. But it's not the only kind of situation we have. You know, we have a couple states, Maine and Vermont, where actually people are not disenfranchised at all, and most states are somewhere in the middle. And New York, obviously one of the largest states in the union, is one of these states that's somewhere in the middle. But it has one of the most confusing felony disenfranchisement laws in the country. New York, an individual with a felony conviction can vote when they're on probation. They can vote when they've fully completed their sentence, their probation, their parole, their incarceration. But if they're on parole in particular, they cannot. And that leads to a lot of confusion, not just among people who are deciding trying to figure out whether they can vote, but even among election officials that are supposed to be administering the law.
Thank you for giving that information, again, about not just how things have happened with respect to voting and civic engagement in New York, but around the country. So, Jazz, let's turn to you now for, the benefits of voting and civic engagement for people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. And so why do you think it's important that we allow these individuals to be a part of the political process?
Well, you can't look at the individuals absent the communities that they come from, because when they are disenfranchised, the community is disenfranchised, right? So every time a busload of new prisoners go upstate in lodge in prisons, that's a busload of votes that is taken from that community, right? And in New York State, I don't know what the exact figures are, but 85 to 90% of the prisoners in New York State are African Americans and Latinos. They're poor people of color, and they come from specific communities, right? A friend of mine, Larry White, did some research, and he said they came from 7 communities, and those communities are primarily poor communities of color, right? So what felon disenfranchisement does, taking those votes away from the community, lessens the community's ability to assert their interests in the political process. And that's the real impact of this. You know, it's not so much the individual, it's the individual's family, his community, you know. And the whole democratic process, man, becomes a charade, you know. In a democracy, voting should be a right, not a privilege. You know, something that you take away, and it has absolutely nothing to do with your crime. Nothing to do with your crime, okay? It's not something that the court sentences you to. You know, it's a collateral consequence, you know. And so, I mean, the impact on the communities is devastating. And the impact on the individual is equally as devastating, simply because he is no longer involved in the political process.
And so I want to come back to this issue because some people weren't involved in the political process before their involvement. So when we talk about civic engagement, that's something that is also an important part of the equation. Because again, people are going on a bus upstate, but how many of them were involved in the political process before they went inside? So we definitely, I want to come back to that one.
Okay.
There's been some progress that have been made on some fronts in some states. I know that there's a couple of bills here in New York State. Can you tell us, Tomas, about what's happening around the country about restoring the rights of people with criminal records to be able to vote?
You know, one of the important things that people should realize is that, just like Jazz explained, these felony disenfranchisement laws are old. They are antiquated. And one of the positive things that are, that we've seen happen in the last couple of decades is states, bit by bit, have been making real progress toward either making rights restoration available to more people, making the process simpler. They're doing it through legislation. They're doing it through amending state constitutions. Just this year, the state of Maryland passed, and now that law is in effect, a law that allows every person who has a felony conviction and is living in the community to vote.
That's great. Less
than 10 years ago, Maryland was a state that had a lifetime ban on voting. That's real progress in a pretty short amount of time. And when you talk about efforts here in New York, there are groups, like the Brennan Center where I work, that are committed to restoring the right to vote, to establishing a law in New York where the process is less confusing, where people are actually able to get their voting rights back. And Jazz brings up this point about democracy. I mean, ultimately, this is what this is about. This is about strengthening democracy. It's about making communities stronger. This is mass incarceration, our flawed criminal justice system paying itself forward. This is the consequence of that. And people are trying to address that.
And you mentioned the state of Maryland being progressive in this area, but also, didn't the state of Kentucky do the exact reverse?
Well, it's interesting. Kentucky's a challenging place. It's a place where you have a lifetime ban that's not just written in a regular law, it's written in the state's constitution. So changing the state's constitution is a complicated process there. And, last year, we worked with groups there to get the outgoing governor to issue a new rights restoration policy. Unfortunately, a new governor came in and put the old policy back where it's a lifetime ban. But that's a place where we're working, where a lot of people are working to make sure that people get their right to vote back. You have real issues there and in other states, and no one said it would be an easy process. But it's one where we're seeing real momentum, and we're actually even seeing support from across the political spectrum. It's not just an issue that progressives or liberal people support, but we've seen conservatives come out in support of this. We've seen support from law enforcement. We've seen support from the faith community. I think it's an issue that kind of draws people together.
And you wonder sometimes why the support, why now, for example, is sometimes a question that comes up. Because there was a big issue about voter disenfranchisement during the Bush election, because so many people in Florida were disenfranchised, and they were saying of people that did not have the right to vote, who had criminal records, might have been allowed to vote, then that might have changed or swayed the election. All these issues come up. But Jazz, you brought up the fact that a lot of the people who lose the right to vote are poor people of color, right? So And I just mentioned that sometimes people are not civically engaged before they go inside. So we're talking about this particular group of people. What is it that we need to do as a community to ensure, to ensure that people are more civically engaged? Because the question then is, if someone is civically engaged, are they less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system in the first place?
Well, I can't address that problem, because that problem is dependent on other factors. Whether they have access to the opportunity structure, and how policy that impacts them directly is made.
Yeah.
But what I want to do is I want to open up the international perspective, step outside this American bubble, because what we are talking about, this conversation right now, is limited to the United States. Our northern border in Canada, prisoners vote from their cells. In America, 2 states, predominantly white, Maine and Vermont, prisoners vote from their cells. They never lose their right to vote. Puerto Rico just took part in the primary elections, and they voted from their prison cells. South Africa, they vote from their cells. Israel, they vote from their cells. Europe, with the exception of the United Kingdom, prisoners vote from their cells, right? So America is way behind, and this is supposed to be the
land of opportunity.
Land of opportunity, democracy's finest example. This is, lack of a better word, BS. So we have to put this in. And I want to give you one little story about the assassin of the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. He was killed by this assassin, and this assassin was found guilty and put in prison. And they wanted to take away his right to vote. This guy killed the Prime Minister of Israel. The Supreme Court of Israel came back and said, no. One thing doesn't have anything to do with the other. You understand? His right to vote was inviolate, because he was a citizen of Israel, right? And I mean, what relationship does having the right to vote have with you committing a burglary or having a small quantity of drugs on you? Non-violent crimes. Crimes between consenting adults. That's what most drug crimes are. They between consenting adults. And yet they take away the fundamental right of a democracy from you.
So what that does is that's going to bring us back to the question that you raised earlier, which is voting a right? And we'll come back to it. Is it a right or is it a privilege? But Tomas, off air we talked about voting and civic engagement as like a tool for reentry. And not just reentry, because reentry means that you were inside and you came home. And you mentioned earlier that you don't necessarily need to be inside of a correctional facility in order to lose your right to vote.
That's right.
So what about a tool for people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system, not just as a tool for reentry?
That's right. And kind of one thing that I think people should understand is that you have so many people that are living and working among us who are affected by this too. And you have a situation when you talk about the ways in which the right to vote can be beneficial. These laws get supported by people who say, look, or by reform efforts, I mean. Reform efforts are often supported by people who come to the realization that, look, there is not a relationship between taking away the right to vote and preventing future crimes. There is not a relationship between taking away the right to vote and actually kind of serving the goals of the criminal justice system, the rehabilitative goals that take place. And when people wrap their heads around that, and when they start thinking about the consequences of the broader criminal justice system, they see, well, what if we did get people engaged? There's a small body of research that speaks to this issue, and it's still an area where there's work to be done. But there's some data that speaks to the fact that people who are civically engaged, in particular people who there's a study, I guess now about a decade old, that talks about, it's a community sample in the Minneapolis area. And the people who reported voting, among that sampled group, recidivated, committed crime again, less frequently than those who reported not voting. There's data from Florida when they had a discretionary rights restoration process in place, where the people who had their right to vote restored, again, committed crimes less frequently than those who did not have their right to vote restored. And so when we look at this, when we look at the testimonials again from people like prosecutors, people like parole and probation professionals, who say this is something that can actually serve the community, can serve the broader cause of public safety, that begins to help win people over, because you're strengthening a community in a lot of different ways.
Got it. And I mean, you make the case about does it have a deterrent effect? But that would mean that the purpose was for deterrence when it didn't necessarily need to be, right? Because if the purpose, as Jazz is saying, it's really about punishment, and it's about punishment that is perpetual. And so Jazz, again, this issue of whether or not voting should be a right or a privilege, why don't you take us down that road? Because let me say this, we had a conversation about how people who even are inside, how they're purchasing goods, how, family members, how whatever they do, they're taxed. And you talk about taxation without representation is an important, fundamental component of our government.
All right, so listen, an organization that I belong to now, Campaign to End the New Jim Crow, we've arrived at the understanding that there's been an intentional dumbing down of the voting population in America, right? Civics is not taught in schools, colleges, universities. I was recently speaking to a class at Hostos in the Bronx, and I asked this class, the full class, how many of you have had civics courses? And only 2 people in the classroom raised their hand. And we've seen surveys on TV where people are asked, who's your congressman? Or, how many branches of government there is.
People have no idea.
and the answers you get are embarrassing. You know what I mean? Embarrassing.
Yeah.
So what we want to do is we want to get start a campaign to get civics taught back in the high schools, in the junior high schools, and make it a requirement for graduation. But we also want to get civics courses in the prisons.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? And make it mandatory for parole. One of the requirements for parole, right? Because prisoners are still citizens.
That's right.
They're still citizens. They have the right to the Constitution still covers them. The legal process, they still have access to it, and they are citizens.
Yeah.
But they, out of all the groups in America, know less about their how their government operates, and so we think that would go a long way towards civic engagement. Right, or promoting civic engagement. And then we want to get it also into the churches. Okay. Right, so that the community will become more involved in the civic, the voting process, civic engagement. Right?
Great. And let me turn to Tomas. We have about 2 minutes left. So why don't you take us out, tell us what do you encourage the community to do insofar as civic engagement is concerned, particularly for people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system?
Well, I think people who are eligible to vote,
Yeah.
regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, should exercise your right to vote. The familiarizing yourself with who is in your government, who represents yourself. I mean, those are things that are fundamental and are really important.
Yeah.
In terms of people who are affected by the criminal justice system, I think one of the things to figure out is, if you live in New York, what is my current status? Am I actually eligible to vote?
Yeah.
Because you might be, if you've fully completed your sentence, or if you're on probation, you're actually eligible to vote.
Yeah.
And you can participate and you can take part. And this is a great year to go ahead and to do that. You've got presidential elections, but you've got state elections too.
Sure.
You've got local elections going on. A lot of ways to become involved. And so first thing is voting. And then the second thing is, if you're not eligible to vote, become familiar with the law in New York. Figure out when you can become eligible to vote, and if you become interested, you can become involved in efforts to try to change the law.
Okay, thank you. Jazz, thank you. We got to go.
I
We
got
got to go.
one final comment, man.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Not to vote is a vote.
Okay.
It's a vote for the status
It's a
quo.
vote for the status
Yeah,
quo. Great.
okay.
Thank you for saying that.
All right.
So again, thank you to our guests, Jazz Hayden and Tomas Lopez. Thank you for joining us on both sides of the bars today, and thank you in TV land for joining us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Ronald Day as we critically look at both sides of the bars. Thank you, guys.